next speaker will be Bruce Huffaker. Bruce is the founder and president of the North American Potato Market News, one of the most respected sources of potato market information. It is widely read across the United States and Canada. Bruce was a commodity analyst for several years, first for Clayton Brokerage of St. Louis, and then for the Pillsbury Company in Minneapolis. He worked for 3 years as a senior buyer for Burger King Corporation. His responsibilities in that capacity included purchasing French fries for all Burger King restaurants in the United States. Bruce has a master's degree in economics from Brigham Young University. His master's project was an analysis of the U.S. potato markets. Please welcome Bruce Huffaker.
Thanks, Dale, and I'd like to thank those who have made it possible for me to come here and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the export arena in the U.S. Potato industry. Let's see. First, it's important to understand where exports fit in the potato market in the U.S. and as well as in Canada. In the U.S., over 16% of the potatoes that are grown are either exported either as fresh potatoes or potato products. It's primarily potato products, but there is a fair amount of fresh potatoes also exported. And over time, the exports have been growing both in volume and in the share of markets. So that's an important thing to understand. Now, for Canada, which I have a little bit of information on the Canadian situation as well, they are even much more dependent on exports for their markets. However, their market is a little bit unique in that a lot of what they do is produce potatoes and potato products that come into the U.S. to backfill the U.S. market and supply the U.S. market, allowing for more of the U.S. Product to be exported through the West Coast ports. And that being the case, you know, there's a lot of talk, a lot of concern about the potato market. You have to understand that the U.S. and Canada, for all intents and purposes, the industry is integrated. If you look at the processors that make the French fries, which is Canada's major export and which is probably from a value standpoint the biggest export in the United States as well, you would find that it's exactly the same companies. And they manage those plants jointly. They manage them to maximize their profits and and the decisions on production are based on logistics and costs for the various plants. So that's an important thing to understand as we go forward in this presentation. Even though exports are the growth area in the potato industry, there's a lot of things that happen in the potato industry or that affect the exports that you have very little or no control over. Those include currency exchange rates, the global economy, and swings in foreign crop production that they can have a major impact on our exports. This chart shows U.S. potato and potato product exports on a raw product equivalent basis. You'll notice that we had a period of time back in the late 1990s and early in the 2000s that exports declined, but they've been growing pretty steadily since that time. They peaked in the year ending, and these are all the data here are year ending September 30th. But in 2014, we peaked at 75.1 million hundredweight in exports. Last year, and this may be one of the reasons last year's market was as soft as it was, is exports went down to 71.6 million hundredweight. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, as you look at market share, we've gone from about, back in 1997, exports were less than 8% of our total market. Now we're up above 16%. In 2014, that was 17.3%, and it dropped down in 2015 to 16.3%. So gives you an idea of the growing importance of global trade for the U.S. market. Now, looking at French fries, this is an interesting concept. What I'm going to show you, I call it the global market, and in that, I do a little bit different than what Guy reported for the European situation, in that I'm only looking at exports from the EU 28 to the rest of the world. And for the U.S. and Canada, I exclude the trade between the two countries. And I do that so that we can kind of get an idea of what's going on globally. This is a chart of what's happened globally since 2003. Exports at that time, global trade was about 2 billion pounds of French fries. It's gone up to 5.6 billion pounds last year. That's a huge growth in exports. There's still a lot more French fries consumed within the EU that are produced in the EU and in North America, produced in North America. But this is the growth area in the marketplace, and it's something to really focus on. In this situation, you'll notice a couple of things, and that is really we have 6 countries listed here as being global exporters of French fries. But if you narrow it down, it's really narrowed down to North America and Europe being the major exporters. If you go back to 2003, North America had a 54.5% share of the market, and the EU market share was 27.3%. Now, for 2015, North America's share has dropped down to 40.7%, and the EU share has jumped up to 50.9%. As Guy indicated, a lot of that is in Belgium. For a while, it looked like Belgium was just going to take over the world, but the Dutch processors have actually stepped in, and there's a lot of growth in their shipments outside of the EU. As Guy indicated, their total exports have been pretty flat, but they have stepped outside of the EU, and they are competing in that market a lot. There's also a fair amount of product that's exported from Germany and from France, and Poland has a growing export business, although that tends to be focused into the former Eastern Bloc countries, so it isn't as big of a factor for us. Taking a look globally, who is it that's buying this product? Japan is taking 12%, Brazil 12%. Brazil a year ago it looked like Brazil might overtake Japan as the largest importer of French fries. However, there's things going on there. They actually are building a new French fry plant in Brazil. They have instigated some anti-dumping activity against the EU to try and make the Brazilian French fries more competitive. So that's a question mark, but the other question mark is if Brazil cuts back on their imports, where does that product go instead? Saudi Arabia is actually the number 3 importer of French fries, followed by China at 6% and Mexico at 6%. Other countries, 55%. So there's a pretty wide dispersion of French fry sales on the global market. Now, if you look at just the EU, it's a little bit a different picture. Saudi Arabia is their largest customer, taking 15% of the product, followed by Brazil with 14% and Russia 7%. Chile takes 5% of the product out of the EU. So you'll notice that there's a lot of European product that goes to South America. Japan, 4%. Now that's an interesting number because that's a big increase relative to what we have seen in the past. Europe made some big inroads into that Japanese market and into some of our other markets during the last year. The U.S., there's a couple of things that I would note about this chart. First of all, our business is much less diversified than the European business. Only 32% of the product is taken by countries other than the top 5 customers that we have. Japan is our largest market with 26%. That is a market that is very mature and has limited opportunity for growth. Mexico, China, Korea, and the Philippines are all much bigger opportunities for growth. But you will notice that with that we are not as competitive as Europe in a number of areas, which includes most of South America. Now, I mentioned earlier, and we've heard a lot of talk about the currency situation. It has a big impact on French fries. It isn't immediate, and we are seeing the dollar going up in value right now, which is a long-term risk to our U.S. market for French fries. We actually peaked out on our net French fry exports at 468 million pounds. That was back in 1995, and we have never exceeded that peak since. When the dollar went up in value and got as high as on that dollar index 107, we saw then net French fry trade swing the other way. And as I say, this isn't that it's somewhat out of phase because you will continue to see a shift even after the value of the dollar peaks. But we dropped down to where by 2004, I believe it was, 2004, the U.S. imported 772 million pounds more French fries than what it exported. So that's a major issue, major concern right now. The trade-weighted dollar peaked in 2002 at 108. And it's been it dropped down to 71 during 2011. The 2015 average was 88.4, and currently, as of last week, it was at 94.9, which is getting to the point where there's a lot of concern there. That big drop, by the way, in net exports was accompanied by a huge increase, and what happened primarily during this last round was that the product was replaced by product that was grown in Canada. We saw a major expansion during that time period of the Canadian French fry plants, and Those plants are still there. They're still running. They are not running at capacity right now. There is a possibility that we could see some growth in imports from Canada again in the coming years. However, the bigger threat is actually product coming into the U.S. from Europe, because Canada, to some extent, at least in some of the provinces, are probably fairly close to maxed out on what they're going to be able to produce and economically ship to the U.S. So we could see some shift of product being produced in Canada and shipped to the U.S. But a bigger threat almost is product coming from Europe. Now, as Guy indicated, a lot of that product that is made in Europe, even though it's concentrated in Belgium and the Netherlands, a lot of those potatoes come from France and Germany to be processed. So there is that growth that's continuing there, and that is a concern. Now, we'll go quickly through the potato flake market. That's a little bit different scenario than what the French fries are. Potato flakes have been growing fairly rapidly. We've seen the potato flakes go from total global trade, and again, it's ex-EU and the U.S., and really those are the only players in the global market of any consequences. But that market's grown from, get my numbers here, 162 million pounds up to 485 million pounds last year. During that time, the U.S. share has gone from 52.6% down to 42.3%, with the EU taking the difference. So there's been a lot of growth in the EU market. And again, if we look at who the customers are, last year Japan was 18%. Japan's growth in imports has been phenomenal this last year, and the U.S. has captured most of that. Malaysia's number 2 with 12%, followed by Mexico, 10%. The United States, now that's an interesting one, but we are 7% of the imports of the global trade. We import. Philippines is number 5 with 5% or 6%, and the others have 47%. If we look at Europe, their big market is Malaysia with 19%, U.S. 12%, and Philippines 8%, Brazil 6%, and Russia 5%, and half their product goes to other countries. United States, again, we're much less diversified. This last year, Japan took 41% of our imports, followed by Mexico with 20%. Mexico is an interesting situation because really what we're doing is we're exporting semi-finished product and bringing that product back in as potato snacks. So that's a big thing that's going on there. Canada's 6%, Australia 5%, and the Philippines 4%. You look at the net exports versus the trade-weighted dollar, and obviously something else is going on in trade with potato flakes, because the mirror image that we saw in French fries just doesn't exist there. If you look at our net exports, we went from almost 250 million pounds back in 1999, and that was a special case when Europe had a crop failure, and Procter & Gamble was shipping all kinds of potato flakes to Belgium to keep that plant, their Pringles plant, running. But other than that, we've dropped down from that peak down to almost zero net exports in 2012. And if you look at this, our imports were pretty flat all the way through about 2007, and then they went through the roof. you wonder what that is. What happened is the potato flake industry was consolidating at that point. They found ways to raise their prices in the domestic market, and some of the U.S. buyers then decided to shift to other suppliers. There's, big ones are Germany and Spain. Belgium, to some extent, was supplying that market, but that's a huge jump. It peaked in 2013, I believe, or 2012, and has come down since then. But just briefly, the outlook, we have positive factors. One positive factor is we have strong growth momentum right now, both in flakes and in French fries. Just to give you an idea of what's gone on the last 2 months, we have U.S. trade data now for October and November, and the French fry exports during that time are up 27.4% from last year. That's a huge jump. Potato flakes are up 32.1%. Just a note of caution on that, almost all of that increase happened in October. The November numbers were not nearly as robust for flakes. So those are the positive factors. Well, that was one positive factor. The other positive factor is Europe had captured all the growth last year in the French fry market because they had a humongous potato crop. Guy indicates it's a balanced crop this year, but there's no way with that balanced crop that the Europeans will be able to capture all the growth in the world market. The negative factors, and these are mostly longer term, you have the strong value of the U.S. dollar, and in the short term, our raw product supplies this year may not be sufficient to maintain that 27% growth in French fries and 31% growth in potato flake exports. So I'd like to thank you, and I guess it looks like my time's up, so we'll leave it at that. And I'll be around here for the next several hours, so if anybody has questions, I can answer them.